Welcome back to Life as a Scale Model. Today we're going to be continuing working on the NX-01. And as you can see, I put a little bit of primer on there in between videos. That's so we could better see where some of the imperfections in the models are. You can see some gaps right here on the warp pylon areas that are maybe a little more pronounced than we would like. So we're going to go ahead and start filling some of that to get those seams to blend better, and we're going to file down some of these areas where the seam joints just don't fit together quite as well as we'd like. And that's just going to give us the illusion of a nice smooth hull the way it would be. I'm going to be using Tamiya putty. It's my go-to. It's pretty easy to work with, and it's relatively thin, and it lasts a long time if you don't happen to be using it for forever. So I'm just going to go ahead now and start with my little tool here that has the bulb at the end. That's my favorite sculpting tool to use for puttying, because the concave shape of it allows you to really push that putty into those seams so that they get filled nice and well. So we'll just start out with a wee little bit of that putty on the end of that ball there, and we're just going to start by touching it to the model. We want to make sure that when we start out we're getting good adhesion. This is a good time to mention that more experienced modelers might tell you it's a great idea to tape things up before you do things like this, and that's absolutely true. You can save yourself a lot of time if you tape over areas around the seam so that you're not getting too much putty in places where you don't want it. However, I figured we would start out kind of doing things the way a beginner would do it. And a lot of beginners aren't going to necessarily think of using tape to keep good clean lines when they put down their putty or their paint. And that's okay. You can always go back and sand things down later. So again, we'll just take a teeny bit and we will lightly put it on the seam where we want it to go. And then once we've got it put in place, we'll use a little more pressure to put it further into that gap. I have to apologize for the framing here. We're still working on making sure that all our framing is tight. But all I'm doing is putting a little bit of putty into that seam that runs down the side of the ship there. Trying to make sure I get it in there good, so that when we get it all painted up, it'll look nice and smooth. Now I'm going to work on the bottom side of this little boom area. Same as I did the last one, just putting little bits of putty in there. Trying my best to keep the putty where I want it to be and not get putty where I don't want it to be. That extra effort will save me some cleanup time there in the future. As you can see, we've got those two seams filled there. I'm just going to put a little bit more where I saw a slight gap. It's okay to have a little too much filler, because you're going to sand it down later. If you don't have quite enough, then you'll end up having to fill it a second time. That's also okay, but I get a little impatient. I did make a boo-boo when I was removing the model pieces from the sprue, and I had a little gash there at the end of the warp nacelle. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill that as well. That's what we end up having to do when we make an oopsie. Now you can see I've got putty on those seams, and they're looking pretty good. And now we got things puttied, we're going to wait for that putty to set up, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is sanding. Off camera, I did a little bit more filling to make sure that my seams would all be nice and smooth. And I wasn't very happy with some gaps that were showing around the edges of the saucer. So what I did is I took some of my model cement and I got that brush in there and I really worked it in between the two halves of the saucer, and then I clamped it and let it dry that way. And that ended up being a really good method for closing the gaps between that saucer section, so that saucer looks like just one whole piece instead of two pieces we glued together. You can see those raised seam lines are still there. We're going to try to tackle those while we do our sanding. A note about sanding as we're getting started. More experienced modelers, more experienced than myself I should say, use various different tools for sanding. We're going to start with some sandpaper. This is kind of a medium grit sandpaper. It's my go-to. I kind of like it. It's fine enough that I don't usually feel the need to sand too much more, and take stuff off real well. And then we've got my file. And I like the files because they're a nice rigid structure. And so if I need to keep things straight or level, they're a pretty good way to do that. You can see it took me a little while to figure out how to get into all them little nooks and crannies. This is a tiny little model, as you can see. So what I ended up doing is I ended up folding my sandpaper a little bit more to make it smaller and more narrow. And that had two advantages. One, it made it a little easier to work with in those tight areas, and two, it also made the piece of sandpaper more rigid, which made it easier to work without having to put pressure directly on the sandpaper while I sanded. I turned it into kind of a little handheld file that I could just pinch between my thumb and my finger there and use the same way I would normally use a file. But the school of thought with more experienced modelers is you start with a slightly higher grit sandpaper, and then you progressively use finer and finer grit sandpaper to really get a good smooth finish on your model. I haven't done that with this model. Again, I'm trying to show you what more of a beginner modeler might do. We're going to work on some of those more advanced techniques down the road as we get into some of the other models we'll be working on with this project. Now, as you can see, I'm using my pick here, and all I'm doing is I'm getting into some of the grooved lines where I got some of that filler putty that I don't want to disappear. I'm just using that to score the lines that I want to have show up. And you're going to see me do a lot of that in this one. I was really surprised just how much recessed detail there was with this little model. This is my first time building this one, so we're flying blind and doing the best we can. But I hadn't expected for there to be such fine recessed detail in this model. And it just shows up on pretty much every single surface. There's something recessed in the plastic that you don't want to lose. So I spent quite a bit of time, as you'll be seeing here in a little bit, using that pick to just score that filler out of those lines and try to bring those lines back out as much as I could. And that's just part of the process you have to do if you're a relatively inexperienced bumpkin like myself who does things the messy way. You can start to see we're having that rigid but tiny piece of sandpaper really came in handy getting between the booms on those on the ship there. The NX-01, she's a good looking ship, but she's got some pretty intricate design elements. And when you're working on a model this small, it does make it kind of difficult to get your tools in there and really do what you want to get done. But we're just going to keep at it. And that's the important thing when you're doing this part of the model, is you really want to keep at it. These are the steps that if you put in a little extra time and a little extra effort, they will yield amazing results. If you do the more preferred method of starting with a higher grit and then working your way down to finer grits until you get a real good smooth finish, then you're going to end up with a model that looks as though it's just one contiguous piece as much as it's supposed to, and it's going to have good, smooth, crisp details that you can really be proud of. So I can't stress enough that it's important to just go slow and take your time as you're doing these kind of intermediate steps of filling seams and sanding down filler and sanding down like raised seam lines. Because yeah, you'll end up with a much better product in the end, and you'll be a lot happier, a lot more proud what you've done. Now these are my mini files, diamond tipped. I'm quite proud of them. You can see they're really small, and I ended up having to break these bad boys out in order to get some of my sanding and filing done, because some of those crevices were just too small for that big old file. You got to be careful with these guys though, because with those diamond tips, they'll file stuff off a lot more quickly. And now that I got that step done, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do another thing of primer. I'm using this Rust-Oleum 2x coverage flat white primer. It's just something I had laying around the shop. It works well. I like it. You can get whatever kind of primer you have available. I usually go to the hardware store and look for it. If you want to get something a little more hoity-toity, Tamiya makes a really good surface primer. I've never used it, but I hear good things about it. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to my technique here. Notice I'm not starting my spray pointing directly at the model. That's because when you start the flow of the spray, it might shoot out a few big globs, and you don't want those big globs getting on your model and making it look terrible. So I start my spray flow pointed away, and then I'd go in short little U-shaped passes, and the U-shape just helps to make sure that you're getting primer and eventually spray paint just everywhere that you need it to go in good even coats. And now that I've done the top, I'm going to go ahead and do the bottom. The cans will tell you about how long you need to let the primer sit before you can start working with it again, and that can be anywhere between 15 minutes to an hour. It really depends on the weather where you're at, how humid it is, how warm it is. On a warm and less humid day here where I live, I can usually start working with my model again after about 15 minutes. It was a pretty warm day, but it felt pretty humid when I did this, so just to be on the safe side, I gave my primer coat about a half hour between, just to make sure that it was really, really dry, because if you get on it and it's not quite dry, it's going to be sticky and tacky, and it's going to get all your little thumbprints and fingerprints in it. You don't want that. You'll have to sand those down again. I'm using the cans just to weigh down my little box. It was a little windy. Now for the base coat, I'm using Tamiya Titanium Silver TS88, as you can see there on the can. I used this on a 1/1000 scale Enterprise that I did quite a few years back, and I was really impressed with the results after I got the model kit all built and decaled and painted and stuff. I'm using the same technique I used when I was doing the primer. I'm not starting the flow of the spray directly at the model, and I'm using those short little U-shapes again to make sure that I get good even coverage. And I'm just working my way around. I'm paying attention to make sure everything's good and covered so that I don't have to come back and redo it. I'm just going from every angle, and I'm just using my little turntable to turn that thing around and spray it from every angle I need to. You can pick up one of those little turntables at any local hobby store you might have. They're not too expensive, maybe about 15, 20 bucks. And I find that they are a lifesaver when it comes to painting. And once again, we're just going to go ahead and repeat that process and get the bottom of the ship base coated so that we can let her dry and then she can be ready for some detail paint. Like I've said already probably too many times this video, just short little U-shape movement with your hand and start and finish that flow of spray when you're not pointing it directly at the model, so you don't get those little globs stuck to your model. You get a nice smooth finish. You can see we got a good finish on ours. I did real well getting the paint on there, despite the wind. The wind had it out for me, but we managed to persevere. And now we get to do some of the fun stuff. We get to do the detail paint. When it comes to the detail painting, I really like, for these Enterprise models at least, to use the Haynes Guide to the USS Enterprise. This is an officially licensed source. It's been, at least in part, put together by the incomparable Michael and Denise Okuda, on top of having a lot of really interesting information about each of the ships and some of the technology behind the ships. As you can see, it's got some really great details on what the ships look like. We can see the ship from every elevation that we could possibly need to see. And I've put some arrows pointing to some of the details that we're going to want to paint when we go back and do the painting process. Now here I have on display the finished painted product that I did off screen because it got kind of boring as I was recording myself painting and I didn't want to, bore you guys to tears. But you can see the finished product that I've painted versus the color of the sprue. And you can see that the color that I've chosen is much lighter than the sprue color. And I'm going to go ahead and discuss a little theory that I've been cooking for a few years based on some experiences I've had in the past. And my theory, I call it my theory of color and scale. And basically what that means is you need to consider the scale of your model and the color that you're going to use as a base color. A few years back, I did a 2500 scale 1701D, and I had done a 1400 scale 1701D previous to that. So when I started the 2500 scale one, I thought, oh, this will be great. I'll just grab the same color I used to base coat the other one, and it'll turn out great. But when I got it on there, it just looked way too dark. And when I started putting on decals, it was even worse. And my theory is that because the model was so physically small, that really dark color that I used on the bigger model just ate that little model up. Kind of like when you take a small room and you paint too dark of a color on it. So I found that when I'm working with these littler models, it's better to take the color I envision in my mind and take it up a couple of notches, just a little bit lighter. That's what I'm trying to say. And when you're doing these particular models, it's also good to consider that the decals are also going to make them look darker by the time you get done. So yeah, that's why my model looks quite a bit brighter than the sprue. Another example of this, if you follow Star Trek modelers or you've been looking around in your research, you might have come across some modelers like Bill Krause, who likes to light models, and he'll tell you, I'm sure, that when you just do straight up LED lights, they are too bright. You need to dim them in order to make them fit the scale of the model, and it really makes those models look next level. So bear that in mind as you're choosing the colors that you use. Now, proper brush technique is pretty universal in most people's minds. You just want to take that paint and you want to pull the brush. You want to pull the brush. You don't want to push the brush or move it too much side to side, because then you risk making that tip of that brush fray. And if you've got a really fine tip, you want to maintain that fine tip as long as you can. So there's our finished product. You can see from the top, we've got all of our elements painted. On the bottom, we did the sensor dome, and we've got the nacelle Bussard collectors and the deflector dish all painted. And I've started the impulse engines there on the back of those booms, and then we've got a really sloppy job with those warp grill chillers. There's another picture of that putty I used. Here are the brushes I used. I used a 3/0 brush to do a lot of the bigger painting. It's the biggest brush on the far right there. And then I started with a 4/0 brush to start doing some of the smaller details, but I wasn't happy with that. So then I moved to my Army Painter brand Insane Detail brush, and it has just the smallest little tip on it, and it made my detail painting a lot better. And speaking of painting, let's go through the paints that I used on this project just real quick. So I used Vallejo Flat Red for the Bussard collectors. I used the Vallejo Flat Blue for the warp engine chiller grills. I used the Vallejo Ivory for the sensor dome on the bottom of the saucer. I used black for those little black rings around the front of the nacelles. I used brass for the deflector dish. I used Tamiya copper for the bridge dome and some of the other copper elements, and then I used sky blue for the impulse engines. I used clear red to paint the running lights, and clear green as well. And since I goofed and made some oopsies, I ordered some Tamiya titanium silver in a pot so I can fix some of my oopsies. And I found I wasn't terribly happy with the copper in some areas, so we're going to do an experiment between this video and the next, and we're going to try this Tamiya titanium gold and see if the color matches the color on the ship a little bit better. I'm really hoping to get some good results from that. Anyway, that's been our painting. Have a great week, and until I see you next, happy modeling.